Back. Had to put the baby down for a nap, but I'm back to give you the second in the series of World War I topics we're going to be covering, which is the nature of the combat. Although this is the third video, again, I apologize for accidentally splitting the first video into two parts. I hit the escape button, which not only takes us out of full screen on the presentation, but also apparently stops recording the video. That's what happened. So on to combat in World War I. All right. So we talked in the last slide or the last videos about the causes of World War I, and those are as described. And if you listened, you found out that they were quite complicated. The rest is not as complicated. It should be shorter videos, so we'll get through them. Combat, World War I. So with all the new technology that was developed in advance of the war, people thought that this war would be over quickly. They thought that, this would be an aggressive, offensive war that would move quickly and large pieces of territory would be taken more easily thanks to things like the machine gun and all that. And politicians also thought that the war somehow would be an easier solution to solving all of the problems that were going on in Europe than conversations and meetings and conferences would have been, and they found out the hard way that that was very, very, very far from the case. Right? Very, very, very far from the case. It ended up being an absolutely brutal war. We don't pay as much attention to it in the United States as students in European countries do, but in countries, especially England, World War I is remembered as certainly the worst of the two world wars. It might be different on the continent, but certainly in England, they had their worst fighting in this war compared to the second. So on, we've got, before World War I actually happened, countries in Europe had plans in case war did break out. As you may remember from the first video and from your reading about the causes of World War I, one of the causes was the aggressiveness of one team, the Triple Entente, against the other, the Triple Alliance or the Central Powers. And they more or less knew that, or at least were more or less ready in case a conflict did break out. And one way that they did prepare was to make these plans. The most famous of these plans is the German plan. In case war broke out, they knew that they would have to go to war with France and Russia because they were two members of the same team. So their plan aimed to solve the problem of fighting a war that was both on their western border and on their eastern border. And that plan was called the Schlieffen Plan, named after this guy who came up with the plan. And their plan was that they would basically invade France with everything they had as quickly as possible, send all of their troops, all of their strength, all of their weaponry into France, and hopefully take over Paris and thereby defeat France in a span of about 6 weeks. And then they could redirect all of their attention towards fighting Russia on the east. However, France also had their own plan that was, as soon as war broke out, was to invade Germany. Kind of oddly fortunate for France, their plan ended up backfiring completely. They were completely forced back out of Germany by the onslaught of German troops, and they were forced back into France. But this was a blessing in disguise because the French were then able to take up a defensive position against the Germans. And ultimately, because they were forced to take up this defensive position, they were able to successfully defend France, successfully defend Paris, and Paris was never taken in the war, and as a result, France never lost the war. You can see this is a map of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany aimed to go through Belgium, which would have taken, or they planned that by going through Belgium, it would have taken France by surprise because Belgium had not taken a side in the war. They had said that they were neutral. They were intentionally not taking sides. So they thought, Germany I mean, that by going through Belgium, they would take France by surprise because invading Belgium was technically illegal. because they were not part of the war. But if they won the war, they would be able to say what was legal and not, right? And here's the French advance. They were clearly not able to get very far into Germany. They were forced to come back. And they dug in this area right here, right? Northeastern France and Belgium as well. And where they dug in, they literally dug. They dug trenches, which we'll learn about in a second. You could see some of the cities here. Verdun is a battle you had to read about. One of these rivers along here is the Somme River. Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S, that's how you pronounce that. That's the site of another major battle in World War I. So you can see where some of these battles happened. It's right where the French and the Germans met along this defensive area right here. All right, so once they literally dug in to fight a defensive war, you had the development of what was called trench warfare. And where trench warfare happened was on the Western Front. They call it the Western Front because it was, if you compare where the fighting was happening, this area of fighting was to the west of this area of fighting, right? So this is the Western Front in France and Belgium, and the Eastern Front was on the border of Germany and Austria with Russia, right? So trench warfare. Basically, and I'll show you a closer, more detailed diagram in a second, you could see that people literally dug trenches in the ground from which they would fight their enemy and hopefully eventually be able to leave their trench, run across an open area between your trench and the enemy's called no man's land, and take land little by little, truly little by little, as the battles wore on. And the area between the two trenches was called no man's land because it was a very slim chance that if you entered no man's land that you would survive. No man's land was filled with barbed wire, which would slow you down, landmines, which would blow you up, grenades filled with poison gas, which would kill you, and of course, probably the most deadly, in your enemy's trench, there were stations of machine guns that were manned by people in the trench, so they were protected, but they could fire at you in no man's land, and basically you would be destroyed. If we take a look here, you can see that there are different types of trenches. We've got no man's land over here where you see these soldiers being exposed to barbed wire and landmines and machine guns, right? But the trenches were divided into your frontline trench. These are where the people would actually fire at the enemy and eventually go over the top. That was the term for leaving your trench and going into no man's land. You had support trenches and you had a reserve trench. So when you were off frontline duty, you might go back and you'd sleep in the reserve trench, come back up, and all that. Clearly, this was not an offensive, aggressive war like people envisioned. The no man's land would be maybe a couple hundred feet, and if you were lucky enough to take it, which was difficult, you would have lost thousands of lives in order to gain that 100 or 200 or 300, 400, maybe 1,000 feet of territory, and you'd be able to lose it just as quickly as you gained it. So it really was a case of wasting a lot of lives to get almost nowhere. In the Eastern Front, where Germany was fighting Russia, war was a little bit different. It didn't end up in the defensive stalemate of trench warfare. It was more of a traditional conflict where things moved a little bit more quickly. The fighting was a little bit more fluid, but it didn't mean that it was any less deadly. In the first year of the war, things went back and forth a little bit. The Russians started off successfully, probably because the Germans were trying to undertake their Schlieffen Plan and go into the West. But once Germany realized that that wasn't going to work, they redirected their efforts back towards Russia as well, split their troops up, and they were able to take back what the Russians had gained. And you can see that in 1915 alone, you had 2 million casualties on that front of the war. When you see in the end of the war that there were 10 million deaths and 20 or so million injuries in the war, 2 million, that's 1/15 of the total casualties in the war. when you count injuries and deaths. But still, 1 year on one side of the conflict, that's a pretty big number.